Krishna, when you're ready.
Thank you, Convener. We have been consistent in our approach here. It's nothing to do with the people or the report, although we have some criticisms of that report, which is actually borne out in terms of the committee papers and the review of it. I was looking back at the minutes there, and it is just over 3 years since we tried to defund this project and move the money to the continuation of library services and to warm spaces. And the belief then, and I was seconding my ward colleague, Councillor Watson, for the Labour group in that time to defund it, and we tried to defund it, I think, at least another twice. So we were consistent in our principled opposition to our so-called Citizens' Assembly. That Citizens' Assembly could not be delivered for the cost. We had criticisms about the scope of where we were going. That is also borne out within the report, and we see that at 5.2.1, where the scope and focus is criticised. And certainly that's what we said in our amendment, where we welcomed the recommendations. They were too numerous in our view. They should have been narrower and more in-depth proposals prepared. There was also a number of proposals which are not within the remit of this council. And that is again borne out within the report about the scope and focus. And that is the argument we have been making for 3 years, Convener, as supported by opposition councillors on this committee. And it is appropriate that we, in the words of Christopher Hitchens, the late great writer and contrarian, question authority and challenge popular opinions, because that is what we are here to do as councillors, rather than blindly following with recommendations. We didn't support the Citizens' Assembly in principle. We never ended up with a Citizens' Assembly because it couldn't be delivered for the cost. The original cost is about double what was previously proposed within the initial committee reports. When we look back at that, just over £20,000 was initially allocated or suggested. That is obviously more than double at the end of the day. And we remain of the view that we have existing forums within our city to engage with people with lived experience and to hear directly from them. We did not need to spend £50,000 to get to the point that we are now at. And that £50,000 obviously also does not take into consideration officers' time in being involved with that. And we have flagged that previously in other committees, that we should be factoring in the time allocation for senior officers whose hourly rates would be into the hundreds of pounds an hour, and the time that they would be spending it on. Because we could have achieved this without having a Citizens' Assembly. So unfortunately, Convener, we consider that we have been vindicated, and vindicated in our lifetime, in our principled opposition to this. We should have taken a more focused approach to the recommendations when they came back, so that we could have perhaps a detailed report on how we could achieve these goals realistically. We also were rightly critical of what we considered to be a political position in relation to the report, that, for example, it had criticisms of the UK government and criticisms of so-called hostile environment policies, whilst not taking into consideration other viewpoints on this. And we made this clear in the last committee meeting on this. That is ultimately our role as councillors, to review and to act like a board in terms of reports. I do think it is worthwhile looking at, when we are asking people to come to this committee to present about the preparation which does go into it, because there is a natural ability and importance, I would say, that there is a dialogue, and that can be sparky, that can involve criticisms which people don't like. But if we are funding a project to the tune of £50,000, it is our obligation to ask questions, and we have always had a principled objection to this approach, and so did the Labour councillors on the committee previously, and so did my colleague Councillor Houghton. There used to be 3 of us on the Conservative group on this committee, but it is now just Councillor Brooks and I on this. So, Convener, we think ultimately we should have taken a more narrow approach to the recommendations that we had, but ultimately we should not have progressed with such a citizens' assembly approach. We opposed it from day one. We opposed it again and again and again. So it's not a criticism of the individuals who are involved, but it's not appropriate to limit our ability to challenge and to critique any recommendations. That is our job as elected members. I do think it would be interesting to have further dialogue with Dr. Southworth about this trauma-informed kind of learning and experience there. That is certainly something that should be brought on board, although from my recollection there weren't any specific questions at committee about specific people's experiences. It was more in relation to the content of that report. So, Convener, we again move this amendment, as we should be doing as a principled opposition. We sought to defund this project. On the 8th of March 2023, we said initially, let's look at where this is going to go. We did not close our minds to it. We said in the previous report, let's look into this, let's see where we're going to go. And when further detail, you can go back, Convener, and look, January 2023, there was an initial scaping of it. And when we looked into that, we said, let's look at where we're going to go with this. But then when it became clear the challenges and the difficulties of so-called citizens' assembly, we quite rightly opposed in principle and set out our views and values on that. So, Convener, I will finish there and thank everyone who participated, but simply say that we should not be looking at doing a citizens' assembly approach in the future. We have appropriate forums to carry out such research and investigation with people who are required to do so.
Councillor Brooks.